The cashier's laugh cut through the hardware store like breaking glass. "You got any proof of that, old-timer?" Her voice carried across the aisles, loud enough for every customer to hear, loud enough for the words to land exactly where she wanted them to land. At the counter stood a man who looked like he had been worn down by decades of weather and neglect. His field jacket hung 2 sizes too large on a frame that had once been powerful. His boots were held together more by habit than leather, and in his weathered hands, he held 7 small American flags. The air conditioning hummed overhead, cold enough to raise goosebumps on skin that had not felt climate control in years. Elwood Raymond Thacker stood perfectly still at the register, his weight balanced, his hands steady despite the laughter still echoing off the metal shelving. He had asked a simple question. He had asked if the store offered a veteran discount. What he had not expected was for that question to become a performance. The young woman behind the counter, her name tag reading Destiny in cheerful purple letters, leaned back and crossed her arms. She could not have been older than 23, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her eyes already decided about the man standing before her. She had seen his type before, or she thought she had. The homeless ones who wandered in from the heat, who asked for water, who lingered too long in the cool aisles, who sometimes tried to walk out with things they had not paid for. And now here was another one, claiming military service for a few dollars off flags that cost less than a cup of coffee. "I asked you a question," she continued, her voice still projected for the audience she had created. "You got a DD-214? A vacarot? Anything that says you actually served?" Elwood's eyes, gray and deep-set beneath brows that had weathered sandstorms and monsoons and the white-hot flash of muzzle fire, simply looked at her. His voice, when it came, was soft, measured, the voice of a man who had learned decades ago that volume was rarely necessary. "I do not carry those documents anymore, ma'am. I apologize for the confusion. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, drop a comment and let us know where you're joining us from. And if you believe that heroes are not always easy to recognize, consider subscribing. Because what happened next in that hardware store would prove just how wrong first impressions can be." Destiny shook her head with theatrical disappointment. "See, this is exactly the problem." She turned slightly, addressing the middle-aged woman browsing garden supplies 3 aisles over, the young couple examining power drills near the back, the retired gentleman comparing paint samples by the window. Every one of them looked up. Every one of them became her audience. People come in here all the time claiming they served, claiming they deserve something special. But when you ask for proof, she spread her hands. Nothing, just stories. A woman near the garden supplies, gray-haired and dignified in a floral blouse, watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. Her name was Margaret Shun, and she had buried a husband who served 2 tours in Vietnam. She knew what service looked like when it had been carried for decades. She knew what it cost. And something about the old man at the counter made her heart ache in a way she could not yet explain. Elwood had not moved. His posture remained unchanged, that unconscious parade rest that 40 years of service had carved into his muscle memory. His right hand drifted almost imperceptibly toward his hip, an old reflex, reaching for a sidearm that had not been there in over a decade. He caught himself, stilled the motion, and simply waited. The flags in his other hand were small, the kind sold for grave decoration, the kind that cost $2.49 each. $17.43 for all 7. He had counted his money 3 times before entering the store. He had exactly $19. The veteran discount would have given him enough left over for a bottle of water. But that was not why he had asked. He had asked because he had earned it. Because the men whose graves would receive these flags had earned it. Because some things are not about money at all. Destiny was still talking, still performing. "And honestly, even if you did serve," she said, "which I seriously doubt, you probably just sat at a desk somewhere. Probably never saw any real action. Probably just want to feel special." The retired gentleman by the paint samples set down his color swatches. The young couple had stopped pretending to look at drills. Margaret Shin took 3 steps closer, her hands gripping her shopping basket until her knuckles went white. Elwood said nothing. He simply stood there, absorbing the words like stones thrown into deep water, letting them sink without ripple. His sleeve had ridden up slightly when he reached for his hip, exposing just a glimpse of ink on his left forearm. Numbers, letters, arranged in a pattern that meant nothing to anyone in that store. But in exactly 4 minutes, the manager would walk out from the back room. In exactly 4 minutes, a man named Derek Vance would see the face of the stranger at his counter and feel his entire world tilt sideways. Because Derek Vance had grown up with a photograph of that face on his wall. Because Derek Vance's father had spent the last years of his life searching for the man, now being publicly humiliated in the store that bore his name. Thacker's Hardware. The sign hung above the entrance, and not a single person in that building, except for the old man clutching 7 American flags, knew why it was called that. Destiny reached for the phone beside her register. You know what? I'm calling my manager. He can deal with this. She picked up the receiver and punched in an extension with sharp, irritated jabs. Maybe he will just let you have the stupid discount to get you out of here. But I want him to see what I have to deal with every single day. She did not notice that her customer had closed his eyes. She did not notice the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the way his breathing slowed and steadied, the way a man who had once led other men through hell was now summoning every ounce of discipline he had left just to remain standing in place. Because Elwood Raymond Thacker, call sign Shepherd, had carried wounded Marines through 800 meters of enemy fire. He had made shots that were still studied at Quantico. He had buried 7 brothers in the ground and visited their graves every Memorial Day for 20 years, alone, with flags just like the ones in his hands. And he had never, not once, asked anyone to believe him. The phone clicked as someone in the back answered. Derek, Destiny said loudly, I need you up front. Got a situation with a guy claiming veteran status. No proof, of course. Just another one trying to game the system. She hung up with satisfaction, certain that backup was on the way, certain that she was about to be validated, certain that the shabby old man before her was exactly what he appeared to be. She had never been more wrong about anything in her entire life. The seconds stretched like wire pulled taut. Destiny drummed her fingers on the counter, each tap a small declaration of impatience, each tap another reminder that she held the power here and the old man before her held nothing at all. The other customers had not returned to their shopping. They stood frozen in the aisles, caught between discomfort and curiosity, witnesses to something they did not yet understand. Elwood remained motionless. His eyes had opened again, fixed on some middle distance that existed beyond the fluorescent lights and metal shelving, beyond the young woman's contempt, beyond the walls of this building entirely. He was seeing something else, somewhere else. The weight of the flags in his hand had transported him backward through time, and for a moment he was not standing in a hardware store at all. He was standing in Arlington. 6 years ago, the grass had been wet from morning rain, and his dress blues had felt like armor he no longer deserved to wear. Sarah's casket had been lowered into the earth beside the plot he had already purchased for himself, and his daughters had stood across from him like strangers. They had begged him to come home with them. They had pleaded, and he had looked at their faces, so much like their mothers, and felt something inside him crack beyond repair. He had left that night. A note on the kitchen table. 3 sentences. I love you. I'm sorry. Do not look for me. That was the last time he had spoken to his children. That was the last time he had slept in a bed. That was the last time he had allowed himself to believe he deserved anything resembling comfort. The memory released him as Destiny's voice cut back in, sharp and theatrical. You know, my boyfriend's cousin actually served. In the army. Real soldier. Did 2 tours overseas. She leaned forward on the counter, her eyes narrow with accusation. And he does not look anything like you. He stands up straight. He takes care of himself. He does not wander around looking like he crawled out of dumpster. Margaret Chin set her shopping basket down with a distinct thud. The sound drew Destiny's attention for only a moment before she dismissed it and returned her focus to the target before her. But Margaret did not pick the basket back up. She stood with her arms crossed, watching, waiting, her late husband's voice echoing in her memory. You can always tell the ones who saw the worst of it, Robert had said once. They carry it quiet. They do not talk about it. They just carry it. The old man at the counter carried something. Margaret could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the stillness of his hands, in the way he absorbed abuse like a man who had long ago accepted that suffering was simply part of breathing. Elwood's voice emerged again, soft as wind through tall grass. Ma'am, I understand your concern. I'm not asking for anything I have not earned. But if the discount is not possible without documentation, I will pay full price. He paused, and something flickered across his weathered face. These flags are not for me. Destiny rolled her eyes with exaggerated drama. Oh, let me guess. They're for your buddies, your fellow veterans. She made air quotes with her fingers, her voice dripping with mockery. Guys you served with in some super-secret mission nobody can verify. The words landed like shrapnel. Elwood's jaw tightened. His eyes, for just a moment, lost their distant quality and focused with sudden intensity on the young woman before him. And in that moment, Margaret Chin saw something that made her breath catch. She saw the ghost of a man who had once commanded other men in places where commands meant the difference between living and dying. She saw authority so deeply ingrained that even decades of hardship could not fully erode it. But the moment passed. Elwood's gaze softened. His shoulders, which had begun to square, settled back into their weary slope. And he simply nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. For men I served with. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, filling the silence that followed. The young couple near the power drills exchanged uncomfortable glances. The retired gentleman had abandoned his paint samples entirely and now stood at the end of the aisle, his face troubled, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Destiny opened her mouth to deliver another barb, but before she could speak, the sound of a door opening echoed from the back of the store. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberate. The manager was coming. Finally, Destiny muttered under her breath. She straightened her posture, prepared to present her case, prepared to be validated in front of everyone who had witnessed this confrontation. Derek Vance rounded the corner of aisle 7. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had learned early how to manage difficult situations. He had run this store since his father's death 3 years ago, had handled countless customer complaints, had navigated every variety of human conflict that could occur within 4 walls and a parking lot. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw when he reached the front counter. His footsteps slowed, then stopped entirely. His face, which had been arranged in the pleasant neutrality of professional management, underwent a transformation that every witness would later describe in different ways. Margaretchen would say he looked like a man who had seen a ghost. The young couple would say he looked like he was about to faint. The retired gentleman would say he looked like a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been turned inside out. Derek's eyes were locked on the old man's face, on the gray eyes, on the silver stubble, on the particular arrangement of features that he had seen in a photograph every single day of his life, a photograph that hung in his office, a photograph his father had kept on the nightstand until the very end. His hand reached out and gripped the edge of a display shelf. His knuckles went white. Destiny did not notice. She was already launching into her complaint, her voice bright with vindication. Derek, this guy claims he is a veteran, but he does not have any proof. He wants the discount anyway. I told him we cannot just give discounts to anyone who walks in off the street claiming they served. She gestured dismissively at Elwood. I mean, look at him. Derek did not respond. He did not even seem to hear her. His lips parted. His voice, when it finally emerged, was barely a whisper. It cannot be. Destiny blinked, confused by her manager's reaction. What? Derek, are you okay? You look like you have seen a ghost or something. She laughed at her own joke. No one else did, because Derek Vance was staring at the man his father had spent the last 15 years of his life searching for. The man his father had spoken of with reverence that bordered on worship. The man whose name was painted on the sign above the entrance, whose face was displayed on a wall in the back room that only employees ever saw, whose legend had shaped the entire trajectory of the Vance family. Derek's eyes dropped to the old man's left arm, where the sleeve had written up just enough to expose the edge of ink. Coordinates. A date. The beginning of a circle of initials. His father had described that tattoo 100 times. 1,000 times. Had traced its design in the air while telling the story of the night his life was saved, the night 7 Marines died, the night a man called Shepard carried him through hell and delivered him to salvation. Derek's voice cracked when he spoke again. Shepard? The word hung in the air like a hell breath. Like a prayer. Like the name of someone who had been mourned and missed and searched for across years and miles, and every dead and a desperate man could find. And at the counter, still holding 7 small American flags, Elwood Raymond Thacker closed his eyes. No one had called him that in over a decade. No one was supposed to know that name. The silence that followed Derek's whispered word was unlike any silence that had ever filled that hardware store. It was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something heavier, something that pressed against the walls and settled into the bones of everyone standing witness. Destiny looked between her manager and the homeless man at her counter, her confidence beginning to fracture at the edges. Derek? What is going on? Who is Shepard? She laughed nervously, but the sound died before it reached the ceiling. Why are you looking at him like that? Derek did not answer her. He could not. His throat had closed around words that were too large to speak. His father's voice was echoing in his skull, telling the story he had heard 1,000 times, the story that had shaped his entire understanding of sacrifice and courage and what it meant to owe someone everything. Elwood's eyes had opened again. He was looking at Derek now with an expression that Margaret Shun would later describe as recognition wrapped in grief. The old man's lips moved slightly, forming words without sound, and then his voice emerged like something dragged up from deep water. How do you know that name, son? The question was quiet, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that made Derek's legs feel uncertain beneath him. He took a step forward, then another, moving past Destiny's register as if she had ceased to exist entirely. My father, Derek said, and his voice broke on the second word. He had to stop. He had to breathe. He had to remember how to form sentences while looking into the face of a man who had become a myth in his household. My father was Corporal James Vance, 1st Reconnaissance Battalion, Fallujah, November 2004. Elwood went completely still, the kind of stillness that only comes when the body is trying to process something the mind cannot yet accept. His weathered hands tightened around the small American flags until his scarred knuckles went white. Jimmy, he breathed. The name came out like a confession, like a prayer for the dead. Jimmy Vance. Derek nodded, tears now streaming freely down his face. He did not wipe them away. He did not seem to notice them at all. You carried him, 800 meters, under fire. He told us that story every year on the anniversary. Every single year until the day he died. The retired gentleman by the paint samples had removed his glasses and was pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. The young couple stood frozen, the woman's hand covering her mouth. Margaret Shun had moved closer, her own eyes glistening, understanding now why the old man at the counter carried himself the way he did. Destiny had gone pale. Her theatrical confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by something that looked like the first stirrings of horror. She looked at the homeless man she had been mocking for the past 10 minutes, and for the first time, she truly saw him. Derek took another step forward. His voice was stronger now, fueled by years of wanting to say these words to a man he never thought he would meet. My father opened this store in 2006, used his disability compensation, every penny of it. He pointed toward the entrance without looking away from Elwood's face. He named it after you, Thacker's Hardware, because he said he owed you everything. His life, his family, me. Elwood's gaze drifted toward the front windows, toward the sign he had walked beneath without reading, without noticing, without ever imagining that his own name could be written anywhere that mattered. I did not know, he said softly. His voice had changed. The measured calm had given way to something rawer, something wounded. I never knew he made it home. After the evac, they separated the wounded. I never got word. He made it home, Derek said. He made it home, and he spent 15 years trying to find you. He hired private investigators. He filed requests with the VA and the Marine Corps. He even testified before a congressional committee about veteran support services, and he mentioned you by name. Shepard, the man who saved his life and then disappeared. Margaret Chin spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the charged air with the clarity of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing. She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Elwood with a mixture of reverence and heartbreak. "Your name is on the sign," she said softly, "and you have been sleeping on the streets." Elwood did not respond. His jaw was working, the muscles tight beneath his stubbled skin, and Margaret could see him fighting to maintain the composure that had carried him through decades of loss. Destiny's voice emerged small and broken from behind a register. "I did not know." The words were barely audible. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the counter edge. "I did not know who he was. I thought he was just another person trying to get something for nothing. I did not know." No one acknowledged her. The moment was too large for her guilt to occupy any space within it. Derek reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands were trembling as he pulled up a photograph and turned the screen toward Elwood. This was taken in 2005. Walter Reed. "My father is in a hospital bed." And that is the photograph he kept on his nightstand until the day he died 3 years ago. Elwood looked at the screen. The image showed a younger James Vance, leg elevated in a cast, grinning despite the obvious pain. And standing beside the bed, in dress blues, with a face that had not yet been weathered by years of grief and homelessness, was Elwood Raymond Thacker. The old man's hand rose slowly, trembling, and touched the screen as if he could reach through time and touch the moment itself. "Jimmy," he whispered again. His voice cracked completely. "I thought you died on that bird. I thought I failed you too." Derek shook his head fiercely. "You saved him. You carried him through 800 meters of enemy fire with rounds hitting the walls on either side of you. You went back twice for the fallen. You held a position for 6 hours until air support arrived." He stepped closer, close enough to touch, though he did not. "My father said you were the finest Marine he ever served with. The finest man he ever knew." The flags in Elwood's hand rustled as his grip loosened, as the strength he had summoned to hold himself together began to falter. 7 small flags for 7 graves. 7 brothers he had carried in his memory for 20 years. And now, standing in a store that bore his own name, he was learning that the one man he thought he had failed had actually survived, had thrived, had built a legacy in his honor. Margaret Chin reached out and placed her hand on Elwood's arm. The touch was gentle, maternal, the first human contact offered in kindness that he had felt in years. Derek wiped his face with the back of his hand and turned toward the back of the store. His voice was rough but determined. "There is something you need to see, something my father built for you." He looked back at Elwood with eyes that held both grief and hope. "Will you follow me, sir?" The word "sir" landed differently than it had from Destiny's mocking lips. It landed with weight, with respect, with the recognition of rank and sacrifice and everything that could never be repaid. Elwood looked down at the flags, still clutched against his chest. Then he looked at Derek, at Margaret, at the witnesses who had stopped being strangers and become something else entirely. And slowly, with the careful movements of a man who had forgotten how to accept anything resembling grace, he nodded. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Derek led the way toward the back of the store. Elwood followed 3 steps behind, his boots scuffing against the polished concrete floor with each measured stride. Margaret Chun walked beside him without being asked, her presence a silent declaration that she was not leaving this man alone. Behind them, the young couple and the retired gentleman followed at a respectful distance, drawn by something they could not name but could not resist. Destiny remained frozen at her register. Her hands had not stopped shaking. Her eyes tracked the small procession until it disappeared around the corner of aisle 12, and then she was alone with the weight of what she had done. But the story was no longer about her. The story was about what waited in the back room. And it was about what had happened 20 years ago in a narrow alley in Fallujah, on a night when the world had been reduced to muzzle flash and screaming and the wet sound of men dying in the dark. Elwood walked, but part of him was no longer in the hardware store. Part of him had slipped backward through time, pulled by the gravity of memory into a place he visited every night whether he wanted to or not. November 2004. Jolin District. The Second Battle of Fallujah had been raging for days, and 1st Reconnaissance Battalion had been tasked with clearing a sector that intelligence had marked as low priority. Intelligence had been wrong. Intelligence was always wrong when it mattered most. They had entered the alley in standard formation. Elwood on overwatch from a rooftop 60 meters back, his rifle scope painting green circles on the darkness below. Nathan Cross on point, moving with the fluid grace that had earned him the respect of every man in the unit. Behind Nathan came the others: Ricky Sandoval, Terrence Williams, Anton Briggs, Marcus Delgado, Jameson Okafor, Dwayne Patton, and bringing up the rear, young Jimmy Vance, barely 22 years old, carrying the radio that was supposed to be their lifeline. The ambush had been perfect. 3 RPG teams positioned in buildings they had already cleared. A kill zone designed by someone who understood American tactics better than Americans wanted to admit. The first rocket hit before Elwood could shout a warning. Nathan Cross died instantly. The blast caught him center mass, and there was nothing left to save. Elwood watched through his scope as his best friend, the man who had stood beside him at his wedding, the man who had held his daughters as infants, simply ceased to exist. Then the machine guns opened up. The memory seized Elwood's chest as he walked through the hardware store, his breath catching, his vision narrowing. He could smell the cordite. He could hear the screaming. He could feel the weight of his rifle bucking against his shoulder as he made shot after shot after shot, trying to create a path, trying to give his men a chance. 7 of them died in 90 seconds. 90 seconds. He had counted it later, reconstructing the timeline from after-action reports, trying to understand how a lifetime of loss could fit into such a small container of time. Ricky took a round through the throat. Terrence was hit by shrapnel from the second RPG. Anton went down trying to drag Marcus to cover, and then Marcus stopped moving too. Jameson, the medic, caught a burst across the chest while running toward the wounded. Dwayne made it almost to the end of the alley before the third RPG found him. And Nathan. Nathan was already gone. The first to fall. The best of them. Jimmy Vance survived because Elwood made an impossible shot. 800 meters. Through smoke and darkness and the chaos of a firefight that had already claimed 7 lives. He put a round through the eye of the machine gunner who had Jimmy pinned, and then he left his position and ran. He ran through the kill zone. He ran past the bodies of men he had trained with and fought with and loved like brothers. He ran until he reached Jimmy, who was bleeding from a leg wound that had severed something important, and he threw the younger man over his shoulders, and he kept running. 800 meters. That was the distance to the extraction point. 800 meters of enemy territory, with rounds snapping past his ears and ricocheting off the walls, with Jimmy's blood soaking through his uniform and Jimmy's voice fading in and out of consciousness. He made it. He delivered Jimmy to the medics on the helicopter, and then he went back. He went back twice. Into the kill zone. Into the alley where 7 of his men lay dead. He carried their bodies out one by one because no Marine gets left behind. He carried them until his legs gave out and other Marines had to carry him. And when it was over, when the sun rose on a city still burning, Elwood Raymond Thacker had 7 sets of initials tattooed around the coordinates of that alley. A circle of names. A permanent memorial etched into his flesh. He had never spoken of that night to anyone outside of official debriefings. He had never sought recognition or praise. He had simply carried it, the way he carried everything, in silence and solitude and the quiet company of ghosts. Derek stopped in front of a door marked employees only. His hand rested on the handle, but he did not open it yet. He turned to face Elwood, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. My father told me this story every year on the anniversary, he said. November 14th. He would sit me down and tell me about the men who died. He knew all their names. He made sure I knew them too. Elwood's voice emerged rough and broken. He remembered their names. Derek nodded. He said you were the one who made sure no one forgot. You carried them out. All of them. even when you could barely stand, even when they told you to stop. He said you kept going back until every single man was accounted for. The small American flags in Elwood's hands seemed to grow heavier. 7 flags, 7 graves, 7 men whose faces he saw every time he closed his eyes. Margaret Shun had tears streaming down her cheeks. The young couple behind her were holding hands so tightly their knuckles had gone white. The retired gentleman had removed his glasses again and was making no attempt to hide his emotion. Derek turned the handle and pushed the door open. Pale light spilled out from the room beyond. "What my father built in here," he said quietly, "was never meant to be a secret. He always hoped you would see it someday. He always believed you would walk through that door." He stepped aside, making room for Elwood to enter. "Welcome to the Wall of Shepherd," Derek said. "My father's way of making sure the world never forgot what you did." Elwood stepped forward into the light, and what he saw stopped him completely. The room was small, no larger than a modest office. But every inch of the back wall had been transformed into something sacred. Photographs covered the surface from floor to ceiling, arranged with the precision of a military memorial. Some were formal portraits in dress blues, young faces frozen in time, eyes bright with the particular confidence of men who had not yet learned what war would cost them. Others were candid shots from deployment, Marines laughing in dusty tents, Marines cleaning weapons in the amber light of a setting sun, Marines standing arm in arm in front of vehicles scarred by combat. And in the center of it all, larger than the rest, was a photograph of 8 men standing in formation. Their faces were young, their postures were proud, and beneath the photograph, in a simple black frame, a brass plaque read "First Reconnaissance Battalion, Fallujah, 2004. 7 gave all. 1 gave everything else." Elwood could not move. His boots had rooted themselves to the threshold, and his body refused to carry him any farther. His eyes moved across the wall, finding faces he had not seen in 20 years except in nightmares and memory. There was Ricky Sandoval, grinning beneath a helmet that sat slightly crooked, his rifle slung across his chest. There was Terrence Williams, caught mid-laugh at something someone had said just outside the frame. There was Anton Briggs, serious and steady, the man everyone trusted to make the right call when everything went wrong. Elwood's hand rose to his chest, pressing against the fabric of his field jacket as if he could slow the heart threatening to break through his ribs. Marcus Delgado, 19 years old in the photograph, barely old enough to vote, already old enough to die. Jameson Okafor, the medic, kneeling beside a wounded Iraqi child in one shot, his hands gentle despite their size. Dwayne Patton, heavy weapons specialist, holding up a fish he had caught during a rare moment of downtime, his smile wide and unguarded. And Nathan Cross. A dozen photographs of Nathan, more than any of the others because Nathan had been the soul of the unit. Nathan playing cards. Nathan reading a letter from home. Nathan with his arm around a younger Elwood. Both of them sunburned and exhausted and alive in a way that seemed impossible from this distance. Below the photographs, mounted in a glass display case, were artifacts that made Elwood's throat close completely. Dog tags. 7 sets of dog tags, arranged in a row, each one labeled with a name and date. And beside them, medals. A Bronze Star with Valor device. A Purple Heart. A Navy Cross nomination letter that had been framed but never processed because the man it honored had disappeared before the paperwork could be completed. Derek's voice came from somewhere behind him, soft with reverence. My father collected everything he could find. Photographs from families, service records, news clippings, anything that would help tell their story. He said the world needed to remember them as men, not just names on a wall. Margaret Shun had entered the room and now stood with her hand pressed against her heart, tears falling freely. The young couple lingered in the doorway, holding each other. The retired gentleman had removed his hat and was holding it against his chest, his head bowed. Elwood took 1 step forward, then another. His hand reached out, trembling, and touched the glass of the display case. Beneath his fingers, separated by only a thin pane, lay the dog tags of Nathan Cross. "I wrote to his sister," Elwood said, his voice barely audible. "After I wrote to every family, told them how their sons died, told them they were heroes. His fingers traced the outline of the tags without making contact. I never heard back from most of them. I think they blamed me. I think they were right to. Derek stepped closer. My father said you carried that guilt like it was your own personal cross. He said he tried to tell you it was not your fault, but you would not listen. You took responsibility for things no man could have controlled. I was Overwatch. The words fell heavy and broken. I was supposed to see threats before they materialized. I was supposed to keep them safe. You made an impossible shot and saved my father's life, Derek said firmly. You went back into a kill zone twice to recover the fallen. You carried 7 men out of that alley when anyone else would have been forgiven for running the other direction. Elwood shook his head slowly. I left them there. When the ambush started, I left them there and took my shots from 60 meters away while they died. You were doing your job, Margaret said softly. She had moved to stand beside him, her presence warm and steady. You were Overwatch. You were exactly where you were supposed to be. The old man's shoulders began to shake. It was subtle at first, a tremor that could have been mistaken for cold or fatigue. But then the tremor grew, and his breath caught, and 20 years of grief that had been locked behind a wall of silence began to crack through. Nathan was going to be my daughter's godfather, he whispered. We had it all planned. After deployment, he was going to come home with me and meet the girls and stand up in church and promise to look after them if anything ever happened to me. His hand pressed flat against the glass, against the dog tags, against the last physical trace of a man who had been closer than a brother. He never got to meet them. He never got to come home. And I've spent every day since then wondering why I did. Derek reached out and placed his hand on Elwood's shoulder. The touch was firm, grounding. My father spent 15 years asking the same question. He said, why him and not the others? He never found an answer, but he found a purpose. Elwood turned, his gray eyes red-rimmed and glistening. A purpose. Derek gestured to the wall surrounding them. This, remembering them, honoring them, making sure their sacrifice meant something. He built this store so he would have a place to put this wall. He built this business so he could take care of veteran employees and their families. He spent his whole life trying to pay back a debt he said could never be repaid. Elwood looked around the room again, seeing it now through different eyes, seeing the care in every arrangement, the love in every photograph, the devotion in every artifact preserved behind glass. Jimmy did this, he said quietly. Jimmy built this. For you, Derek said. For them. For everyone who served and never got the recognition they deserved. He paused, his voice thickening. And he died 3 years ago, still hoping you would walk through that door. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of grief and gratitude colliding, of a man confronting the evidence that his survival had meant something to someone, that his sacrifice had been seen and honored and remembered. Elwood's knees buckled, not dramatically, not completely, but enough that Margaret and Derek both reached for him, steadying him, holding him upright when his own strength failed. And in that small room, surrounded by the faces of 7 fallen brothers and the legacy of the one who survived, Elwood Raymond Thacker allowed himself to weep for the first time in 20 years. The tears came in waves, not the silent, controlled grief of a man accustomed to swallowing his pain, but something deeper, something that had been buried so long it had calcined around the edges, and now it was breaking free in jagged pieces that tore at his chest with every breath. Margaret guided him to a chair in the corner of the room, a simple wooden chair that James Vance had probably sat in 1,000 times while he looked at this wall and remembered. Derek brought a glass of water from somewhere, pressing it into Elwood's scarred hands, waiting while the old man gathered himself enough to drink. The young couple had retreated to give him space, but they had not left. They stood in the hallway, the woman wiping her eyes, the man staring at the floor with the expression of someone whose understanding of the world had just been fundamentally altered. The retired gentleman had found his own seat on a storage crate near the door, his hat still clutched against his chest, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer. And somewhere in the front of the store, Destiny Marlowe sat alone at her register, replaying every word she had spoken, every laugh she had unleashed, every assumption she had made about the man who had just been revealed as a legend. In the back room, Elwood's breathing slowly steadied. He looked up at the wall again, at the faces of his brothers frozen in time, and something shifted in his expression. The raw grief remained, but beneath it, a different emotion was emerging, something that looked almost like wonder. He remembered them, Elwood said quietly. His voice was hoarse but gaining strength. All of them, not just me. Derek knelt beside the chair, bringing himself to eye level with the man his father had spent a lifetime honoring. He remembered everything. He used to sit in this room for hours, just looking at the photographs, talking to them. He said it helped him feel less alone. Elwood's gaze found the photograph of Nathan Cross again, the one where Nathan was laughing, caught in a moment of pure joy that seemed impossible given where they had been and what they had been doing. Did he ever find Nathan's sister, Rebecca? Derek nodded slowly. She came here once, about 10 years ago. My father tracked her down and invited her to see the wall. She stayed for 3 hours. She cried, and before she left, she gave my father something. He rose and moved to the display case, opening it with a small key from his pocket. From within, he withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, and carried it back to Elwood. Nathan wrote this the night before the ambush, Derek said. He gave it to Rebecca before deployment with instructions to open it only if something happened to him. She kept it for 6 years, and then she gave it to my father because she said the words belonged here with the rest of his memory. Elwood's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was achingly familiar, the same cramped script he had seen on 100 reports and requisition forms, the same letters that had spelled out jokes and complaints and the occasional line of poetry Nathan pretended he did not write. The letter was addressed to no one in particular. It began simply, "If you are reading this, then I did not make it home. That is okay. I made my peace with that possibility the day I enlisted. What I need you to know is this. I serve beside the finest men I have ever known. And the finest of them all is a man named Elwood Thacker." Elwood's vision blurred. He had to stop. He had to breathe. Margaret's hand found his shoulder and rested there, warm and steady. He read on. "Elwood does not know how to fail. It is not in his nature. So if I am gone and he is still standing, I need you to tell him something for me. Tell him it was not his fault. Tell him that whatever happened, he did everything any man could do and more. Tell him that I am proud to have served beside him, proud to have called him my brother, and proud to have known that when the worst came, he would be there." The words swam on the page. Elwood gripped the paper so tightly it began to crinkle at the edges. "And tell him this," Nathan had written. "Do not carry me like a burden. Carry me like a blessing. I got to live a life worth living because I had brothers worth dying for. That is more than most people ever get. So do not mourn me too long, Elwood. Live. For both of us. That is an order." The room had gone completely silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to have faded, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Derek spoke softly. "Rebecca said Nathan wrote letters like this before every major operation, just in case. But this was the only one that ever had to be delivered." Elwood folded the letter carefully, his movements precise despite the tremor in his hands. He held it against his chest for a long moment, feeling the weight of words that had waited 20 years to reach him. "He knew," Elwood whispered. "He knew I would blame myself." Margaret squeezed his shoulder. "He knew you. That means he knew you would try to carry more than any one person should." Elwood looked up at her, at this stranger who had somehow become an anchor in the storm of the last hour. "Why are you still here? You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Margaret's eyes glistened. "My husband was Robert Chin. 2 tours in Vietnam. He came home with the same look in his eyes that you have, the same weight on his shoulders. And I spent 40 years trying to help him understand that surviving was not a sin." She crouched down, bringing her face level with his. "He passed 8 years ago, but before he went, he made me promise something. He made me promise that if I ever met another veteran drowning in that same guilt, I would not walk away. I would stay. Because that is what we do for the people who served. We stay." Elwood looked at her, for a long moment. Then his gaze moved to Derek, to the young couple in the hallway, to the retired gentleman on his storage crate. All of them had stayed. All of them had witnessed his unraveling and chosen to remain. Something in his chest loosened. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that his next breath came a little easier than the one before. Derek reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone. "There's one more thing," he said. His voice carried a new weight, something between hope and hesitation. "My father was not the only one looking for you." Elwood frowned. "What do you mean?" Derek pulled up a contact list and turned the screen toward him. "After the wall was finished, my father reached out to everyone from your unit who was still alive. There are 3 of them. They formed a group to keep searching for you, even after my father passed." He paused. "They are in a video call group right now. They have been waiting for this moment for 15 years. Elwood stared at the screen. 3 names. 3 men he had served with. 3 men he had assumed had forgotten him, had moved on, had built lives that no longer included the ghost of a failed team leader. "Would you like to speak with them?" Derek asked. The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Elwood looked at the wall of photographs, at Nathan's letter still pressed against his heart, at the faces of the living who surrounded him and the faces of the dead who watched from their frames. And slowly, with the courage of a man who had once charged through 800 meters of enemy fire, he nodded. Derek tapped the screen 3 times, and the phone began to ring. The sound filled the small room, each electronic trill stretching into eternity, while Elwood sat motionless in the wooden chair, Nathan's letter still pressed against his chest like a talisman. The call connected. 3 faces appeared on the screen, arranged in small boxes that could not contain the magnitude of the moment. 3 men in their 60s and 70s, hair gone gray or white or missing entirely, faces lined by decades of living. But their eyes were the same, the eyes of men who had seen the same darkness and somehow emerged on the other side. The first face belonged to Gunnery Sergeant Victor Ruiz, retired. He had been logistics for First Reconnaissance, the man who made sure equipment and supplies reached the forward teams. His jaw went slack the moment the video connected. The second face was Master Sergeant Theodore Okonkwo, retired, communications specialist. He had been the one who coordinated the extraction that night in Fallujah, the voice on the radio guiding the helicopters through hostile airspace. His hand flew to his mouth. The third face was Sergeant Major Leland Price, retired. He had been Elwood's commanding officer, the man who had written his commendations, the man who had testified at the inquiry that cleared Elwood of any wrongdoing. His eyes filled with tears before anyone spoke a word. For a long moment, no one said anything. The silence stretched across cell, towers, and internet connections, and 20 years of searching, bridging the gap between men who had once been brothers and then became ghosts to each other. Victor Ruiz spoke first. His voice cracked on the first syllable, and he had to start again. "Shepard." His face crumpled. "Oh God, Shepard." Theodore Okonkwo pulled off his glasses and pressed his palm against his eyes. "We thought you were dead. The VA marked you deceased in their system 12 years ago. Clerical error. We found out 5 years later, but by then the trail was cold. We thought we were searching for a ghost." Elwood stared at the screen, at the faces of men he had served beside, men he had assumed had moved on without him. He had not spoken to any of them since the memorial service in 2005. He had disappeared into his grief and never looked back, certain that no one wanted to hear from the man who had failed to bring their brothers home. "I am here," he said. The words came out rough and broken. "I am here." Leland Price leaned closer to his camera, his eyes red, but his voice steady with the command authority that had never fully left him. "Where have you been, son? We have had people looking for you for 15 years. Private investigators, veterans groups. We even got a congressman involved 3 years ago." Elwood shook his head slowly. "I did not want to be found. I thought I did not deserve to be found." "Deserve?" Victor's voice rose with something between anger and anguish. "Elwood, you carried 7 men out of that alley. You saved Jimmy Vance's life. You held a position for 6 hours until air support could extract the wounded. What part of that makes you think you did not deserve to be found?" "The 7 who did not come home," Elwood said quietly. "I was Overwatch. I should have seen the ambush coming. I should have warned them sooner. Theodore shook his head fiercely. I was on the radio that night. I heard everything. You called the warning the moment there was anything to see. The enemy was dug in. They had prepared that kill zone for days. No Overwatch in the world could have spotted them in time. You did everything right, Leland added, his voice firm. The after-action review was unanimous. The inquiry cleared you completely. You were recommended for the Navy Cross, Elwood. Did you know that? The paperwork was submitted 3 weeks after the operation. Elwood frowned. Navy Cross. You disappeared before it could be processed, Leland said. We could not find you to present it. The recommendation sat in a file for 12 years until someone decided you were dead and closed the case. He paused, his jaw tightening. You were a hero, Elwood. You were a hero, and you have been living like a man who has something to be ashamed of. The words landed like hammer blows. Elwood gripped the arms of the chair, his scarred knuckles going white. On the screen, 3 men who had known him at his best were looking at him as he was now, weathered and worn and hollowed out by years of self-imposed exile. Margaret stepped closer, her voice gentle but clear. They search for you because they love you. They never stopped searching because they never stopped believing you were worth finding. Victor wiped his face with the back of his hand. We started a fund, Shepard, Meath and Theo and Lee. Every year on the anniversary, we put money aside. We said when we found you, we would make sure you never had to struggle again. Elwood's breath caught. You did what? You are a brother, Theodore said simply. Brothers do not abandon each other. Even when one of them runs away and hides for 2 decades. The words were sharp but not unkind. They carried the particular weight of military camaraderie, the kind of bond forged in shared suffering that civilians could admire but never fully understand. Leland leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from grief to something that looked almost like hope. Where are you right now, Elwood? What city? Derek answered before Elwood could. He is in Fredericksburg, Virginia, at Thacker's Hardware. He paused, emotion thickening his voice. My father's store. Leland's eyes widened. Jimmy's boy? Yes, sir. The 3 men on the screen exchanged glances, and something passed between them. Some unspoken agreement. Some decision made in the space of a heartbeat. We are coming, Victor said. His voice left no room for argument. Theo is in Richmond, Lee is in Norfolk, and I am in D.C. We can all be there in 3 hours. Elwood shook his head. You do not have to do that. We have been waiting 15 years to do this, Theodore said. 3 more hours is nothing. Leland nodded, his eyes never leaving the screen. Stay where you are, Shepard. Do not disappear again. We are coming to bring you home. The words hit Elwood like a wave. Home. He had not had a home in 6 years. He had not believed he deserved one. And now 3 men were dropping everything, driving hours across Virginia to stand beside him in a hardware store that bore his name. I will be here, he said softly. The words felt foreign in his mouth. Promises were not something he made anymore. But this promise, felt different. 3 hours, Victor repeated. And Shepard? When we get there, we're going to tell you something we should have told you 20 years ago. Something you need to hear. The call ended, and the screen went dark. But the room felt fuller than it had before. Warmer, as if the presence of those 3 men had somehow traveled through the signal and remained. Derek placed a hand on Elwood's shoulder. They never gave up on you. Elwood looked at the photographs on the wall, at Nathan's grinning face, at the dog tags behind glass, at the letters still clutched in his weathered hands. I gave up on myself, he said quietly, and they refused to accept it. Margaret smiled through her tears. That is what family does. And for the first time in 20 years, Elwood allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he still had one. The 3 hours passed in fragments. Moments stretched and compressed in ways that defied the steady movement of the clock on the wall. Derek closed the store early, flipping the sign on the front door and locking out the rest of the world. The young couple and the retired gentleman had finally left, but not before each of them had approached Elwood and offered something. A handshake, a word of thanks, a promise to tell others what they had witnessed. Margaret refused to leave. She had called her daughter to explain she would be late, and then she had settled into a chair near Elwood, as if her presence was the most natural thing in the world. She did not try to fill the silence with words. She simply sat with him, her company a quiet declaration that he would not face the coming hours alone. Destiny had not moved from her register since the backroom revelation. Derek had spoken to her briefly, and whatever he had said had left her pale and trembling. She had not attempted to approach Elwood or offer any further words. She simply sat in the empty store, staring at nothing, trapped in the wreckage of her assumptions. Elwood had been given food, a sandwich from the small refrigerator in the break room, a bottle of water, an apple that he could not bring himself to eat. His stomach had closed around the weight of everything that had happened, and sustenance felt like an afterthought compared to the magnitude of what was coming. He spent most of the 3 hours looking at the wall. He studied each photograph as if seeing them for the first time. He read the newspaper clippings that had been preserved behind glass, articles about the Second Battle of Fallujah, about the casualties sustained, about the heroism displayed by American forces in the deadliest urban combat since Vietnam. His name appeared in several of them. Master Gunnery Sergeant Elwood Thacker. Shepherd, the man who would not leave his brothers behind. He had never read these articles before. He had avoided all coverage of the battle, all recognition of what he had done, all reminders of the night that had broken something fundamental inside him. And now, surrounded by evidence of how others had remembered that night, he was beginning to understand that his memory was not the only one that mattered. Derek joined him at one point, standing beside the wall with his arms crossed. "My father used to say that guilt is a liar," he said quietly. "It tells you that you are responsible for things you could not control. It tells you that your survival was a theft instead of a gift." Elwood's jaw tightened. "Your father was a wise man. He learned it the hard way." Derek's voice softened. "He struggled too, you know, for years after he came home. Survivor's guilt nearly destroyed his marriage, nearly cost him his relationship with me. But he found a way through it." "How?" "This." Derek gestured to the wall. "Purpose. He could not bring back the men who died. He could not undo what happened in that alley. But he could make sure they were remembered. He could build something that honored their sacrifice. And he could spend his life helping other veterans find their way home." Elwood was silent for a long moment. "And it worked?" It gave him a reason to keep going. Derek turned to face him. "He used to say that the dead do not want us to suffer. They want us to live. They want us to carry their memory forward, not as a burden, but as a torch." Nathan's letter had said something similar. "Carry me like a blessing, not a burden." The words had been written 20 years ago by a man who knew he might not survive, and they had waited all this time to reach the one person who needed to hear them most. The sound of car doors closing broke the stillness. Then another, and another. Derek moved to the window and looked out at the parking lot. His face broke into something between a smile and tears. "They are here." Elwood rose slowly from his chair. His legs felt unsteady, his heart pounding against his ribs with a force that made breathing difficult. Margaret stood beside him, her hand finding his arm, offering support without words. The front door opened, and 3 men walked into Thacker's Hardware. Victor Ruiz came first. He was shorter than Elwood remembered, his hair completely white now, his frame thickened by age. But his eyes were the same, sharp, knowing, filled with an emotion that 20 years of searching had not diminished. Theodore Okonkwo followed close behind. He moved with a slight limp, a reminder of an injury sustained in a different deployment, a different war. His glasses were pushed up on his forehead, and his cheeks were wet before he even crossed the threshold. Leland Price entered last. He had been Elwood's commanding officer, the man who had sent him into that alley, the man who had written the letters to the families of the fallen. His posture was still military straight despite his 72 years, but his face carried a softness that Elwood had never seen before. The 4 men stood in the empty store, separated by 20 feet and 20 years, and for a long moment no one moved. Then Victor broke. He crossed the distance in 5 quick strides and wrapped his arms around Elwood with a fierceness that threatened to crack ribs. The sound that came from his throat was something between a laugh and a sob, a release of tension that had been building for 2 decades. "You stubborn fool," Victor choked out. You stubborn, beautiful fool. We never stopped looking. Not for one day. Theodore joined the embrace, his large frame enveloping both men. I told you, he said to no one in particular. I told you he was still alive. I told you we would find him. Leland approached more slowly. He waited until Victor and Theodore had released their grip, and then he stood before Elwood with the bearing of a man who had something important to say. Master Gunnery Sergeant Elwood Raymond Thacker, he said, his voice carrying the formal weight of ceremony. Call sign Shepherd. I need you to hear something, and I need you to hear it from me. Elwood straightened instinctively, his body responding to command authority even after all these years. Yes, sir. Leland's eyes glistened, but his voice did not waver. On November 14th, 2004, you performed actions above and beyond the call of duty. You made an impossible shot that saved the life of Corporal James Vance. You entered a kill zone under enemy fire to recover the bodies of 7 fallen Marines. You held a defensive position for 6 hours until air support could extract the wounded and the dead. You did not leave a single man behind. The words hung in the air, formal and precise, the language of commendation and recognition. For these actions, Leland continued, you were recommended for the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration that can be awarded to a member of the United States Armed Forces. That recommendation was never processed because you disappeared. He paused, his jaw tightening. But the recommendation was never rescinded. It has been sitting in a file at the Pentagon for 20 years, waiting for you to be found. Elwood's breath caught. What are you saying? I am saying that 3 weeks ago, when we learned you might still be alive, I made some phone calls. I called in every favor I had left. Leland reached into his jacket and withdrew a small box covered in dark blue velvet. And I'm saying that this belongs to you. He opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of white silk, was a Navy cross. The metal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its bronze surface polished to perfection, its ribbon arranged with military precision. Elwood stared at it. His hands remained at his sides. His eyes filled with tears he could not stop. This is not official yet, Leland said softly. There will be a ceremony. Paperwork. The full recognition you deserve. But I wanted you to see it. I wanted you to know that your country has not forgotten what you did. That we have not forgotten. The room had gone completely still. Margaret stood with her hands pressed over her heart. Derek had tears streaming down his face. Victor and Theodore flanked Elwood like honor guards, their presence a wall of support against the weight of the moment. And Elwood Raymond Thacker, call sign Shepherd, looked at the medal he had never sought and finally understood that surviving was not a betrayal of the dead. It was the fulfillment of their final wish. Elwood did not reach for the medal. His hands remained at his sides, trembling slightly, as if touching the bronze would make the moment too real to bear. The Navy Cross gleamed in its velvet box, waiting with the patience of something that had already waited 20 years. Leland did not press him. He simply held the box open, offering without demanding, allowing Elwood the time he needed to absorb what was happening. Victor broke the silence with a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You know what the worst part was? We had a pool going. On when we would find you. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. Theodore said 5 years. Lee said 10. I said you would walk back into our lives when you were good and ready, and not a moment sooner. Theodore shook his head. Should have known Victor would be right. Stubborn recognizes stubborn. The gentle ribbing was familiar, the language of men who had learned to express love through insults and competition. It was the dialect of the barracks and the forward operating base, of long nights on watch and longer days under fire. And hearing it now, after so many years of silence, loosened something in Elwood's chest. I did not think anyone was looking, he said quietly. I did not think anyone wanted to find me. Leland's expression tightened with something like anger, though it was not directed at Elwood. That is on us, son. We should have tried harder. Should have found you sooner. When the VA marked you deceased, we should have known it was a mistake. We should have kept pushing. You could not have known. We should have known. Leland's voice cracked. You do not survive what you survived and then just disappear. Men like you do not give up. They get lost. They get buried under weight they should never have to carry alone. But they do not give up. Victor stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Elwood's face with an intensity that demanded attention. "We failed you, Shepard, not the other way around. You saved Jimmy's life. You brought our brothers home. You did everything right. And then we let you walk away carrying guilt that was never yours to carry." The words struck like physical blows. Elwood had spent 20 years believing he was the one who had failed, believing that his survival was a debt he could never repay, believing that the families of the fallen, the men he served with, the entire world that had witnessed his inadequacy would be better off if he simply faded into nothing. And now, 3 men who had been there, who had heard the radio traffic and read the after-action reports and testified at the inquiry, were standing before him, saying the opposite. Theodore removed his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, a nervous habit Elwood remembered from 2 decades ago. "You want to know what really happened that night? Not the official version, the real version." Elwood nodded slowly. Theodore replaced his glasses and met his eyes. The ambush was set up by a former Iraqi army colonel who had been studying American tactics for months. He chose that alley specifically because he knew our procedures. He knew we would clear the buildings first. He knew we would send a small team through in standard formation. And he knew exactly where to position his men to maximize casualties. Victor picked up the thread. Intelligence failed. Command failed. The entire operation was compromised before you ever took your position on that rooftop. You were given bad information and sent into a trap that had been designed by someone who understood us better than we understood him. Leland's voice was heavy with old fury. "I have read every document related to that night, every report, every analysis, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that no Overwatch in the world could have prevented what happened. The enemy was invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. And by then, it was too late." Then why? Elwood started, his voice breaking. "Why did I survive when 7 men did not?" The question hung in the air. The question he had been asking himself every day for 20 years. The question that had driven him to abandon his family and live in the shadows and refuse every kindness offered. Theodore answered first. "Because you were 60 meters back. Because your position gave you the angle to make that shot. Because Nathan put you there specifically because he trusted you to cover their 6. Victor nodded. "Nathan made that call. He positioned you on that rooftop. And when everything went wrong, your position was the only reason anyone made it out at all." The invocation of Nathan's name sent a tremor through Elwood's frame. Nathan had chosen his position. Nathan had placed him on Overwatch. Nathan had trusted him with the lives of every man in that alley. And when the ambush came, Nathan had been the first to fall. Leland closed the distance between them and placed his free hand on Elwood's shoulder. The weight was grounding, an anchor against the storm of revelation. Nathan knew what he was doing. He knew that if the worst happened, you would be in position to save whoever could be saved. He was not just your best friend, Elwood. He was a brilliant tactician, and his last tactical decision was putting you exactly where you needed to be. The tears came freely now. Elwood did not try to stop them. He stood in the middle of Thacker's hardware, surrounded by men who had never stopped believing in him, and let 20 years of grief pour out. "He saved me," Elwood whispered, "by putting me on that roof. He saved my life. And you honored that," Victor said fiercely, "by saving Jimmy, by bringing everyone home, by making sure no Marine stayed in that alley." Theodore stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Elwood again. "You honored him every day, Shepard, even when you did not know it, even when you thought you had failed. You survived, and that was exactly what Nathan wanted." The embrace expanded as Victor joined, then Leland, the 4 men standing in a tight circle of shared loss and hard-won understanding. Margaret watched from the edge of the room, tears streaming down her face, witnessing a reunion that had been 20 years in the making. And in the middle of that circle, still holding the velvet box, Leland pressed the Navy Cross into Elwood's hands. "Take it," he said softly, "not because you need it, but because they need you to have it. Nathan, Ricky, Terrence, Anton, Marcus, Jameson, Dwayne, they need the world to know what you did for them." Elwood's fingers closed around the box. The metal was cool against his palm. The weight was heavier than he expected, or perhaps that was just the weight of finally accepting what he had spent 2 decades refusing. For them, he said quietly. For all of them. And the 3 men who had searched for him across years and miles, and every dead and nodded in unison, because that was exactly the right answer. The circle of men slowly released, each one stepping back with the reluctance of people who had waited too long for something precious to let it go easily. Elwood stood in the center of the store, the Navy cross clutched in his scarred hands, his face wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. Derek had watched the entire reunion from near the counter, giving the veterans their space while bearing witness to everything. Now he stepped forward, his expression carrying the weight of something unspoken. There is more, he said quietly. Something my father wanted you to have. Something beyond the wall. Elwood looked up, his gray eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. More? Derek nodded and reached into his pocket. He withdrew a folded document, yellowed at the edges, bearing the letterhead of an attorney's office. My father updated his will 6 months before he died. He had been searching for you for 15 years by then, and he was starting to accept that he might not find you in his lifetime. But he never gave up hope. He unfolded the document and held it where Elwood could see. This store, Derek continued, his voice thickening with emotion. Thacker's Hardware. He named it after you. But he did more than that. He left instructions that if you were ever found, half of everything would belong to you. The building, the business, the inventory, all of it. Elwood shook his head immediately. No, I cannot accept that. This is your inheritance. Your father built this for you. My father built this for you, Derek said firmly. He built it to honor your name. He built it to give jobs to veterans who needed work. He built it to create a place where the wall could exist. And he spent every day hoping you would walk through that door and see what your sacrifice had inspired. Victor placed a hand on Elwood's shoulder. Jimmy talked about this shepherd. Every time we saw him, he talked about the store and the wall and what he was building. He said it was all for you. He said it was his way of repaying a debt that could never be repaid. Elwood's legs threatened to give out again. He reached for the counter edge to steady himself, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was being told. A business, an inheritance, a legacy built in his honor by a man whose life he had saved. I was living under a bridge, he said quietly, for 6 years. I was eating out of dumpsters and sleeping in a tent held together with duct tape. And the whole time, there was a building with my name on it 20 miles away. The irony was not lost on anyone. The tragedy of it hung in the air, the years of suffering that could have been avoided if circumstances had aligned differently, if the VA had not made a clerical error, if Elwood had not been so determined to disappear. Theodore removed his glasses again, pressing his fingers against his eyes. We should have found you sooner. We should have looked harder. You could not have known, Elwood repeated, though his voice was hollow. Nobody could have known. Leland stepped forward, his bearing still commanding despite the emotion in his eyes. What matters now is what happens next. He gestured to the document in Derek's hands. Jimmy's will is clear. The inheritance is yours if you want it. But more than money or property, there is something else waiting for you. Elwood frowned. What else could there possibly be? Derek and Leland exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then Derek pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. My father was not the only one searching for you, Derek said carefully. When he started reaching out to your old unit, word spread. People who had served with you, people whose lives you had touched, and eventually, word reached someone else. Elwood's heart began to pound. A cold dread crept up his spine, mixing with something that might have been hope. What are you talking about? Derek found what he was looking for and turned the screen toward Elwood. On it was a photograph. 2 young women in their late 20s, standing arm in arm at what appeared to be a graduation ceremony. They had the same dark hair, the same determined jaw, the same gray eyes that Elwood saw every time he looked in a mirror. His daughters, Catherine and Elizabeth, the girls he had left behind 6 years ago with nothing but a note on the kitchen table. They never stopped looking either, Derek said softly. They hired their own investigators. They contacted every veterans organization they could find. And 3 months ago, they reached out to my father's network. Elwood could not breathe. His chest had constricted around his lungs, squeezing the air out in increments. The photograph blurred as fresh tears flooded his vision. They know I am alive. They know you are alive, Derek confirmed. And they know you are here. Right now. The phone in Derek's hand began to ring. The sound was jarring in the silence. Each electronic tone a herald of something that Elwood had convinced himself would never happen. Derek looked at the screen, then back at Elwood. It is them. They have been waiting by the phone since I texted them an hour ago. They want to talk to you. He paused, his voice gentle. Do you want to answer? Elwood stared at the ringing phone. His daughters. The girls he had held as infants. The teenagers he had watched graduate from high school. The young women he had abandoned in their moment of greatest grief because he could not bear to look at faces that reminded him of everything he had lost. He had told himself he was protecting them. He had told himself they were better off without him. He had told himself 1,000 lies to justify his cowardice. And now those lies were crumbling in the face of a simple truth. They had never stopped looking. His hand reached out, trembling violently, and took the phone from Derek. The screen showed an incoming video call. 2 names, Catherine Thacker Morrison, Elizabeth Thacker Webb. They got married. They had built lives. And they had never given up on finding their father. Elwood pressed the answer button. 2 faces appeared on the screen. 2 young women who looked so much like their mother that Elwood's heart shattered all over again. 2 pairs of gray eyes, wet with tears, staring at him through the digital connection. Daddy? Catherine's voice cracked on the word. It was the voice of a little girl trapped inside a grown woman. The voice of someone who had been waiting 6 years to say that single word. Elwood opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was drowning. Drowning in grief and joy and shame and love, all of it crashing together into something too large for words. Elizabeth spoke next, her voice steadier but no less broken. We found you. She was crying and laughing at the same time. We finally found you. And Elwood Thacker, the man who had faced enemy fire without flinching, who had carried 7 fallen brothers through a kill zone, who had survived 20 years of guilt and 6 years of self-imposed exile, felt his knees in the middle of the hardware store and wept. I am sorry, he managed to choke out. I am so sorry. I should never have left. I should never have abandoned you. I am so sorry. On the screen, both of his daughters pressed their hands against their phone as if they could reach through and touch him. We do not want an apology, Catherine said fiercely. We want our father back. And Elizabeth, through her tears, added the words that would echo in Elwood's heart for the rest of his life. Come home, Daddy. Please, just come home. The video call lasted 47 minutes. Elwood remained on the floor for the first 10, his knees pressed against the cold concrete, his body unable to support the weight of what was happening. Victor and Theodore eventually helped him to a chair, but he never let go of the phone. He clutched it like a lifeline, staring at the faces of daughters he had convinced himself he would never see again. They told him everything. Catherine had finished law school 2 years after he left, had married a man named David Morrison, had given birth to a son named James. She had named the boy after the grandfather he would never meet. But also, she admitted through tears, after the hope that her father would someday come back to know him. Elizabeth had become a nurse. She worked in the trauma unit at a hospital in Richmond, saving lives the way her father had once saved lives in a different kind of war zone. She had married a firefighter named Thomas Webb, and they were expecting their first child in 4 months. Elwood listened to every word. He learned that his daughters had never sold the family home. They had kept it maintained, kept his belongings exactly where he had left them, kept his chair at the kitchen table empty during every holiday dinner. They had refused to give up. They had refused to let him become a ghost. We knew you were alive, Elizabeth said, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. We could feel it. Mom used to say that when you love someone that much, you can feel them in the world. And we never stopped feeling you. The words broke something open in Elwood that he had not known was still sealed. All those years of believing he was doing them a kindness by staying away. All those years of thinking his presence would only bring them pain. And they had been waiting for him, setting a place at the table, naming children after the family he had abandoned. I have a grandson, he said slowly, as if testing whether the words were real. I have a grandson named James. Catherine smiled through her tears. He is 3 years old. He has your eyes, and he's been asking about his grandpa ever since he learned the word. Elwood pressed his palm against his chest, against the heart that was somehow still beating despite everything it had endured. I missed so much. I missed everything. You are here now, Elizabeth said firmly. That is what matters. You are here now, and we are not letting you disappear again. The call ended with a promise. Catherine and Elizabeth were driving down from Richmond immediately. They would arrive within 2 hours. And when they walked through the door of Thacker's Hardware, they would see their father for the first time since the morning he had vanished from their lives. While Elwood processed the magnitude of what was coming, Derek quietly took care of practical matters. He made calls. He arranged things. And when he returned to the group gathered in the store, he carried news that added another layer to an already overwhelming day. I spoke to the hospital in Richmond, he said carefully. Elizabeth's hospital. Word has spread about what happened here today. The story is already moving through veteran networks, social media, everywhere. Elwood looked up, confusion mixing with exhaustion. What do you mean spreading? Derek held up his phone, showing a Facebook post that had already accumulated thousands of shares. Someone in the store this morning posted about what they witnessed. The cashier confronting a homeless veteran. The manager recognizing him. The wall. Everything. He paused. It has gone viral, sir. People are calling it the most incredible veteran story they have ever heard. The retired gentleman who had been in the store, Elwood realized. Or perhaps the young couple. Someone had documented the moment and shared it with the world, and now that world was responding. Leland stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. This could be a good thing, Shepard. Your story can help other veterans, other men and women who are living in the shadows, believing they do not deserve to be found. If they see what happened here today, maybe some of them will reach out. Maybe some of them will let themselves be helped. Elwood considered this. For 20 years, he had hidden from recognition. He had refused medals, avoided ceremonies, disappeared rather than accept gratitude he did not believe he had earned. But the recognition being offered now was different. It was not about glorifying war or celebrating violence. It was about showing what was possible when people refused to give up on each other. Victor sat down beside him. There is something else you should know. That fund we told you about, the one me and Theo and Lee have been building for 15 years? He exchanged glances with the other men. It is not a small amount, Shepard. We invested it, grew it, and combined with what Jimmy left you in his will, you are looking at enough money to never worry about anything again. The numbers did not register. Money had not mattered to Elwood in years. He had lived on nothing and needed nothing and wanted nothing except the peace of oblivion. But now, sitting in a hardware store surrounded by brothers and watching the clock count down to a reunion with his daughters, he began to understand that the resources being offered were not for him. I do not need money, he said slowly, but I know men who do. I know where the camps are. I know who is sleeping under bridges and in abandoned buildings. Veterans. Good men who got lost the same way I did. Leland nodded, a smile breaking across his weathered face. That is exactly what Jimmy would have wanted. Use the store. Use the wall. Use everything he built to help others find their way home. Derek added his voice to the chorus. We can expand the veteran employment program my father started. We can partner with organizations that specialize in veteran housing and mental health. We can turn this place into something even bigger than what he imagined. The vision took shape in Elwood's mind, not a monument to his own survival, but a lifeline for others who were still drowning. A place where men and women who had served could find work, find community, find the kind of welcome that had been waiting for him in this building all along. Before he could respond, the front door opened. 2 women stood in the entrance, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. One was tall and dark-haired, wearing a blazer over a simple dress. The other was shorter, visibly pregnant, her hand pressed against her belly as if steadying herself for what was about to happen. Catherine and Elizabeth, his daughters, no longer faces on a phone screen, but real, physical, present. The store went absolutely silent. Elwood rose from his chair. His legs trembled beneath him, but they held. He took one step forward, then another. Each movement felt like crossing a battlefield, each inch of distance a territory reclaimed from years of self-imposed exile. Catherine broke first. She crossed the store in 5 running strides and threw her arms around her father with a force that nearly knocked him backward. The sound that came from her throat was not a word, but something deeper, something primal, the release of 6 years of grief and hope and desperate waiting. Elizabeth followed, her arms encircling both of them, her tears soaking into Elwood's worn field jacket. The 3 of them stood in the middle of Thacker's Hardware, holding each other as if letting go would mean losing each other all over again. "I am sorry," Elwood whispered into his daughter's hair. "I am so sorry." Catherine pulled back just enough to look at his face. Her eyes, so much like his own, were fierce through the tears. "Stop apologizing. Just promise us you will stay." Elwood looked at his daughters, at the brothers who had never stopped searching, at Derek, who had inherited his father's mission, at Margaret, who had stayed simply because staying was what good people did. "I promise," he said, and for the first time in 20 years, he meant it. 6 weeks later, the cemetery was quiet except for the rustle of wind through the oak trees that lined the memorial section. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rows of white headstones, each one marking a life given in service, each one standing as testament to sacrifices that most people would never fully understand. Elwood walked the familiar path with steady steps. His boots were new, a gift from his daughters, but his gait was the same measured cadence he had carried for 50 years. Beside him walked Catherine, her hand linked through his arm. Behind them came Elizabeth, moving more slowly now in her 8th month, supported by her husband Thomas. And bringing up the rear, Victor, Theodore, and Leland, dressed in suits they had not worn in years, their faces solemn with the weight of the occasion. They stopped at a row of 7 headstones arranged in a gentle arc. The stones were identical in shape and size, but each bore a different name. Ricky Sandoval, Terrence Williams, Anton Briggs, Marcus Delgado, Jameson Okafor, Dwayne Patton, and at the center of the arc, Nathan Cross. Elwood had visited these graves every Memorial Day for 20 years, always alone, always carrying flags he could barely afford, always speaking words that no one else would hear. But today was different. Today he was surrounded by people who loved him. Today he was not carrying his grief in solitude. He knelt before Nathan's headstone and placed his hand against the cool marble. The engraving was simple: name, rank, dates of birth and death, and a single line beneath: "Greater love hath no man than this." "I brought them to meet you," Elwood said quietly. "My girls. You never got to be their godfather like we planned, but they know who you were. They know what you meant to me." He paused, his voice thickening. "And they know that I'm only standing here today because you put me on that rooftop, because you saved my life one last time without even knowing it." Catherine knelt beside her father, her hand finding his shoulder. She had heard the full story now, every detail, every name, every moment of that night in Fallujah. She understood why her father had broken, why he had run, why he had believed that his survival was a betrayal rather than a gift. And she understood, finally, why he had come back. Elizabeth lowered herself carefully, Thomas helping her find a stable position on the grass. She placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of Nathan's headstone, the same flowers she had brought for each of the 7 graves. "Thank you," she said softly, speaking to a man she had never met. "Thank you for saving our father. Thank you for giving him back to us." The morning light shifted as clouds passed overhead, casting patterns of shadow and gold across the memorial grounds. Victor and Theodore and Leland stood at attention, their postures straight despite aging bodies, their eyes fixed on the graves of men they had served beside and mourned for 2 decades. Elwood rose slowly, his knees protesting the movement. He turned to face the people who had gathered behind him, the family he had abandoned, and the brothers who had refused to let him stay lost. I spent 20 years believing I failed them, he said. His voice was stronger now than it had been 6 weeks ago, steadier, carrying the conviction of a man who had finally found solid ground beneath his feet. I spent 20 years hiding from a truth I could not face. But the truth was never what I thought it was. He looked at the 7 headstones, at the names carved in marble, at the flags planted beside each one. They did not die because I failed. They died because war takes the best of us without reason or mercy. And my job was never to prevent their deaths. My job was to honor their lives, to remember them, to carry their memory forward so that their sacrifice would mean something. Leland stepped forward, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew the velvet box containing the Navy Cross, the same box he had presented 6 weeks ago in Thacker's Hardware. The ceremony is scheduled for next month, he said. Pentagon, full honors. But I thought you might want to wear this today. For them. Elwood took the box and opened it. The metal gleamed in the morning light, bronze and ribbon and the weight of recognition he had spent 2 decades refusing to accept. He lifted it from the silk and held it for a moment, feeling its heft, understanding finally what it represented. Not glory, not pride, but remembrance. He pinned the medal to his chest, above his heart, where it would rest for the remainder of the ceremony and for every ceremony that followed. Catherine wiped tears from her cheeks. Elizabeth leaned into her husband, one hand on her belly where new life was growing. Victor and Theodore and Leland stood witness, their eyes bright with emotion they did not try to hide. And Elwood Raymond Thacker, call sign Shepherd, turned back to the graves of his brothers and spoke the words he had been carrying for 20 years. I am still here, still trying, and I am not trying alone anymore. He reached into his pocket and withdrew 7 small American flags, the same flags he had tried to purchase that morning at Thacker's Hardware, the same flags that had started everything. One by one, he planted them beside the headstones. Ricky, Terrence, Anton, Marcus, Jameson, Dwayne, Nathan, each flag a promise, each flag a memorial, each flag a declaration that the men who had fallen in that alley would never be forgotten. When the last flag was planted, he stepped back and saluted. Behind him, Leland and Victor and Theodore raised their own hands in salute, honoring the dead with the precision of men who had never forgotten how. The moment held. The wind stilled. The world seemed to pause in recognition of something sacred. And then Catherine's voice broke the silence, soft but clear. Dad, there is someone who wants to meet you. Elwood turned. Standing at the edge of the path, holding his mother's hand, was a small boy with dark hair and gray eyes. 3 years old, wearing a tiny pair of khaki pants and a polo shirt, looking at his grandfather with the curious, unguarded gaze of a child who did not yet know how heavy the world could be. James, Catherine said, her voice trembling. This is your grandpa, the one I told you about, the hero. The boy studied Elwood for a long moment. Then he released his mother's hand and walked forward with the fearless confidence of the very young. He stopped directly in front of Elwood and looked up at the metal pin to his chest. Are you a soldier? The boy asked. Elwood knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with his grandson. The movement was slow, deliberate, the action of a man who wanted to remember every detail of this moment for the rest of his life. He said softly. A long time ago. The boy reached out and touched the Navy Cross with one small finger. Did you fight bad guys? Elwood smiled, the expression unfamiliar on his weathered face, but growing more natural with each passing day. I fought to protect people I loved, and I fought beside the bravest men I ever knew. James considered this with a gravity only a 3-year-old could muster. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and wrapped his small arms around his grandfather's neck. I love you, Grandpa, he said simply, and Elwood Thacker, who had survived Fallujah and 2 decades of guilt and 6 years of homelessness, who had been lost and found and finally brought home, held his grandson against his chest and whispered the words back. I love you too. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes walk among us in the most unexpected forms, please consider subscribing to our channel. and share with us in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life? Who deserves to be seen for who they truly are? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not wearing uniforms. Sometimes they're standing right beside us, waiting to be recognized. Thank you for watching. And remember, every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary.